Hi everyone, Bill Duvendak here with another digital course. I am going to talk about one of the fundamental concepts in the Western esoteric tradition. And as a matter of fact, it's so fundamental that this is going to be a free class. I'm doing this because I see a lot of people researching these elements online through whatever website appeals to them. And, that's fine because there's a lot of basic information out there. And 99.9% of the time, it's all going to match and overlap. This really isn't exactly rocket science here. But the reason I want to do this class is just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. In the Western esoteric tradition, going back a number of centuries, it is a metaphysical principle of understanding that the world that we live in, the world we know about, the world that we exist in and interact with is in some way, shape, or form a combination of these elements, but also only one specific element. Now, I realize that may sound contradictory, and I realize that may sound very, very basic, and it is. As much as the elements that you see on the screen in front of you are actual elements used in classic occultism, it's also a way of understanding the planes of existence. So what we're going to focus on in this class are attributes and characteristics of each one of the elements, how we got to this point, and what you can do with this information. So for those of you that have not taken any of my courses, this is a good overview and a chance to check it out. In the YouTube description box will be a link to my website with other courses as well. So continue. First of all, the four elements as we know them come to us from two specific sources, ancient Babylon and ancient Greece. Now, the ideas that made up and make up the elements as we use them today come from these two places. Now, from Babylon, what was brought was the idea of earth, air, fire, and water, and how they correspond to the four cardinal directions. The Greeks took that information and grafted it onto their own system. Now, it should be important to note and to point out that the way this information transpired from Babylon to Greece was via the Silk Road. The Silk Road does not get mentioned enough in occult circles as to the influence it has and has had on the Western esoteric tradition over the last approximately 3,000 years or so. Because it's through the Silk Road that Babylon communicated those ideas with Greeks. As you can see on the screen in front of you, it was overland through Persia and then caught an aquatic route up until Italy and Greece and the rest of the Med. But also, if you notice, the land route then turned aquatic and brought things down to Egypt. So as much as the Greeks were influenced by Babylon, there was some influence coming up to them from Egypt as well. So what you basically have is the fact that the elements in the Western esoteric tradition is an amalgamation of ancient Persian ideas, ancient Egyptian ideas, and the original thought that the Greeks were having at the time that it was brought over. The reason this is important is because in the West, there are those four elements and then the element of spirit, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And in Eastern traditions, specifically Chinese traditions, there were five elements as well, but they don't exactly match up. For example, iron ore, metal, that is an element in Eastern traditions that is not found in the West. So that part of the Eastern tradition did not make its way as far west As Babylon, via the Silk Road, it was more regional. Here in the West, we've got earth, air, fire, and water. Egypt had earth, air, fire, and water as well, and as we'll see in a moment, the ancient Greeks were working on something that was very, very similar to it, and it was easy to graft the two systems together as that information was brought forward. Now, we've got to take a slight deviation here, because in order to understand the Greek perspective on things, we must first understand that the fundamentals of ancient Greek medicine lied in the four humors. So, in their philosophy, the four humors influenced health, and that diseases were divine punishment or gifts from the gods. So, first of all, we understand that there were only four. Secondly, we understand that they influenced health, and they were either curses or blessings from deities. So, in a lot of ways, this was a very primitive understanding of cause and effect. Now, the four humors that were in the Greek system, and the Greek medical system specifically, at the time of all this coming together, were phlegm, blood, yellow bile, and black bile. So if you stop and think about it a moment, what you see is that the four humors that are present are different kinds of liquid, colors of liquid, states of liquid that the human body excretes at various points for various reasons. For example, we all need blood to survive, but I'm pretty sure a lot of us have been sick enough where we puked up mucus and it came out as yellow bile. So then, of course, black bile, on one hand, that's coagulated blood. On another hand, I'm thinking of stages of cancer where someone spits up black. So we can see how these four particular fluids and bodily releases had their understanding in Greek thought, and Greek medicine knew about them and even worked with them to the degree that they were not only part of the underlying medicinal culture of ancient Greece, but also the magical culture and magical principles as well. So everyone had these four humors, but the humors were influenced by, number one, geographic location, number two, social class, number three, diet, number four, trauma, five, beliefs, and six, mindset. So, for example, what they're saying is, yes, everybody has these, but to what degree everybody has them in is based on geographic location, and then a host of other maladies. And these maladies are more subjective to the individual. So it'd be the same thing as saying, oh, yeah, you're from the north. Well, then you're going to have sinus problems when you come south. That would be an example of the geographic location. But from there, everything is very, very subjective and very, very open. On one hand, when it says that the humors were influenced by social class, it is saying the social class was around to the degree that the ancient Greeks understood that the richer you were, the better you ate. So the more your humors were going to be balanced and aligned. That ties into point three as well, diet. But then they're also saying, we understand if you've had a traumatic life, that's going to influence the humors that are found as well. So it was very interesting because in this way, the ancient Greeks blended together metaphysics and basic natural sciences in a way that up until that point really hadn't been done. So then, what we can take from this is the fact that a lot of basic Persian magic was brought over to the ancient Greek system, and the Greek system itself was also influenced by ancient Egypt. And then at the bottom of the screen, you see that I've got the correspondences for the elements as we know them today and the four humors. The black bile was earth, blood was air because it's the lifeblood, yellow bile was fire, and phlegm was water, as anyone who's ever had a stuffed up nose would tell you. So now let's break these down and take a look at them individually. The first one we have is the physical element of the earth itself. Dirt, soil, mud, all things related to the physical world. That's kind of key there because it broadens our horizon to understand that anything physical and tangible we see is part of the earth element. The earth itself, in ancient Greek thought, it was known as Gaia. Grounding, discipline, steadfastness, focused on the here and now, practicality, consistency, good at using resources, responsible, durable, dependable, accountable. All of these traits correspond to the element of earth. The archangel of earth is Uriel. The main astrological planet is Saturn. Earth also corresponds to old age, wisdom, maturity, as well as money, health, the physical form, and using your resources wisely. Colors associated with the earth are those that you would expect: browns, greens, and shades in between. Earth is considered cold and dry. I'm going to save the scathing comments. The kingdom of the gnomes corresponds to the earth, and the leader of the gnomes is Gob, and the cherub is the bull, which is the astrological sign of Taurus. Now, in addition to Taurus, there are two other astrological signs that are earth signs: the mutable earth sign of Virgo and the cardinal earth sign of Capricorn. So Capricorn, Virgo, and Taurus are all earth signs. Now, when it comes to the direction, we've got to have a slight discussion here. This is something that is not being talked about enough in occultism, and it's a very important point. Almost everything you read is coming from a Eurocentric perspective when it comes to elements and a lot of traits. That's a problem. And the reason it's a problem is because Europe is located above the equator. So all the books and all the things that you've been reading are coming from a slanted perspective. That slanted perspective is only embracing 50% of the planet with its intelligence and application. So, for example, every time you see that the element Earth corresponds to the direction of north, understand that that is coming from a north of the equator perspective. It's not all-encompassing of the whole planet. I had my eyes open to this many years ago at a Temple of Ascending Flame gathering when I was speaking with an Australian friend of mine that I had met there. And one of the things we were discussing is that the fact that these correspondences of elements to the directions are wrong 100% if you live south of the equator, because they're slanted towards people that live north of the equator. And I said, tell me about this. And he said one of the things that's a small movement in Australia at the time is getting people south of the equator to correspond their elements to the directions in a way that works for them, because they understand that the teachings of the Western esoteric tradition are Eurocentric and therefore only apply to half the planet. So, of course, when he tells me this, it's boom, mic drop, and my first thought is, yeah, that's a huge flippin' problem. Wow, I'm surprised this has never been discussed before. So he told me of some correspondences that were being discussed in Australia, and they're reasonable and they make sense. So if you live south of the equator, consider the logic behind the correspondences that I'll share through this class, but ultimately make your own decision. However, simply know that 90% of the material you read is written from a north of the equator perspective, and therefore when you see things like this, don't feel that you should adjust what you're doing to line up with that. Understand that that is north of the equator, you're south of the equator, so in that way you're in uncharted territory, but that also means the correspondences are more open to your interpretation. Case in point, one of the things this friend of mine and I discussed was the fact that in Australia, Earth corresponds to south, not north, because Antarctica is closer than mainland China and Asia. So it makes sense. And I said, you know what? That's absolutely brilliant. I 100% agree with that. So Earth should be in the south. Now, on a regular wheel, the opposite direction of north is south. And in the Western esoteric tradition, north of the equator, south usually corresponds to fire. And the reason it does is because the sun travels across this round planet we live on. And from north of the equator, we see that the sun is at its height of potency when it's in the southern part of the sky. That's how you get the association of element to the of fire to the direction south. Now, common sense and science tells us that it's the opposite south of the equator. So when they consider the sun at its highest, most influential point in the sky, it is in the direction of north. Ergo, south of the equator, fire would be in the north, and Earth would be in the south. Now, that's the perspective that I am writing this from with this class. If you live south of the equator and you know of different rationale and different justifications for putting the elements in different directions, by all means, do that. You know, ignore what I've got to say on it. I've lived north of the equator my entire life, so even though I'm doing my best to give you a clear, just, and balanced approach and understanding to this, my view is still subconsciously slanted, and I know that. So when you see direction north here, understand that's from a Eurocentric perspective, north of the equator. So if you live south of the equator, please feel free to adjust or talk to people that you know that live south of the equator and come to a consensus, because the bigger you can build the thought form, the more potent it's going to be. However, Earth is also a passive element. Now, this is a slight tangent into astrology, but I'm going to keep it brief. Basically, astrology and alchemy say that the elements are either active or passive. In astrology, it's called negative or positive. Now, active or passive is pretty self-explanatory. The passive elements mean that they are open to influences from the outside environment. So they are open and receptive to impressions. The active elements, or the positive elements as they're called in astrology, are more the proactive forces. They're the go-getter forces. Now, the way I'm laying it out in this class is active and passive. And the reason I'm taking that approach is because that comes to us from alchemy. If you're into astrology or you want to know more about that, they would be called positive or negative. But in this case, it is wise to understand that that's positive and negative like nodes on a battery, not perspectives of consciousness. So you can have a negative sign with a positive in personality perspective. Just so we're clear. But Earth is considered passive, which also means it's considered negative or receptive. Now we move on to the element of water. And this is liquids. This is water and all things related, such as ice, but also emotions, empathy, intuition, spirituality, feelings, and initiation. The archangel of the element is Gabriel. Now, the main astrological planet is Venus or the moon. And here's why they're both there. In traditional astrology, Venus is considered a water planet, except for the fact that it does not rule a fucking water sign. So I understand that's traditional astrology, and I even understand the logic behind it, but it's antiquated. So the alternative is the moon. The moon is considered feminine. The moon has an extreme pull on our emotions, as has been proven by science over the last several hundred years. So the main astrological planet can be either one, or you can use both in conjunction because they're both feminine. Now, chronologically, water corresponds to older adulthood and interpersonal connection. I put these on almost as an afterthought in this class because these really tie into the Native American concept of the medicine wheel and the elements aligning with the different directions. But the thing that the medicine wheel does in addition to that is it also says that these four elements and these four directions line up to phases of our life. So Earth, which we were looking at earlier, is old age and eventual death. Water would be the stage right before that, older adulthood, maturity, interpersonal communication. So then fire and air also have correspondences that we'll talk about in a moment as well. Water corresponds to love, creativity, the imagination, sensuality. The colors are blues and all shades of blue. Water is considered cold and moist. I'm going to say moist instead of what's printed on the screen because I realize moist makes people uncomfortable, and if you're not facing your discomforts, then you're not growing. Now, elementally speaking, water is the kingdom of the Undines, whose leader is Tharsis, and the cherub of water is the eagle, which corresponds to the astrological sign Scorpio, which is a fixed water sign. The other two water signs in astrology are mutable Pisces and cardinal Cancer. And then finally, the direction that corresponds to water is west in the northern hemisphere and east in the southern. And water is considered a passive element like the element of earth. Now we move on to fire. Fire, of course, corresponds to fire and all things related, from lava to magma to fire to friction. It also corresponds to activity, motion, energy, aggression, vitality, warfare, passion, intensity, movement, spiritual fire, spiritual connection, anger, focus, and athletics. You know, I don't really think I have to explain fire much past that, really. But fire is prana. It's the energy of life. It's the physical engagement that we have with the physical world and what we're physically doing. But the dual meaning with the element of fire is that it's also spiritual fire and spiritual connection, such as the Holy Spirit concept from Catholicism. The archangel of fire is Michael. The main astrological planets are Mars and the Sun. Fire corresponds to youth, but in this case, teenage years and the early 20s, so it's that very much warrior maiden phases of life. The colors are reds and all shades thereof. Fire is considered hot, baby hot, and dry. The kingdom that corresponds to fire are the salamanders, whose leader is Djinn, which is separate from the race of beings known as the Djinn. Or are they related? You just never know. And the cherub is the lion, Leo, a fixed fire sign in astrology. The other two fire signs in astrology are mutable Sagittarius and cardinal Aries. Now, the direction of fire is south in the northern hemisphere, but north in the southern hemisphere. And fire is the first one of the ones we've been discussing that are an active element. So fire is moving forward. It's not waiting for things to happen. It's making things happen. Whereas earth and water wait for impressions and signs from the environment around it, fire says, I don't care what you think, this is what I'm doing. So it's a different mentality. And then finally, we come to air. Air is air and all things related. So breath in the lungs to hurricanes and gales of all kinds. So in that way, it's also invisible. Now, the archangel of air is Raphael. The main astrological planet is Mercury. And from a medicine wheel perspective, air corresponds to youth, childhood, and the formative years. Now, air also represents the intellect, thought, the mental plane, logic, reason, but also aloofness, detachment, good social skills, being out of touch with your emotions, logically cold. All of those correspondences have to do with the element of air. Now, the colors are yellows and all shades thereof. Air corresponds to heat and moisture, and it is the kingdom of the sylphs, whose leader is Peralda. And the Carabic is the energy-bearing human, the fixed astrological sign of Aquarius. The other two astrological signs of air are mutable Gemini and cardinal Libra. And air corresponds to the east in the northern hemisphere and west in the southern, and it, like fire, is considered an active element. There's a reason that I roll them out in this order, but I'm not really going to get into that now. I'm going to leave it up to you to figure out on your own. Now, in addition to those four elements, there's also cross-quarter elements. Dun, dun, dun. So you can pretty much see what these are from the couple of typos on the screen and what I have to say. Southeast, so the point between east and south, is considered the airy part of fire. Southwest is the fiery part of water. Northwest is the earthy part of water. Northeast is the earthy part of air. So you can see how these and the other four cardinal elements all laid the foundation for the neopagan wheel of the year that is still currently used today. So let's take a closer look. Southeast is the airy part of fire. So it's that fire that is not necessarily burning as intensely, but it's burning everywhere. Southwest is the fiery part of water, so it's the part of water that does not sit still. It's the part of water that's in motion, like a breeze on a very windy day, or even a tsunami. Northwest is the earthy part of water, so think more like mud. Northeast is the earthy part of air, so think more like the air that's close to the ground, that's a breeze between two buildings, rather than the air up in the sky that makes the clouds a couple of miles above you move. That's the easy way to understand them. But I think it's important to put these in here on any discussion of the elements because they are the halfway points, and they also show how the elements blend together, which gives weight and substance to what has been said during this class about the Native American medicine wheel and how it ties into everything. Anyway, I realize this is a brief cursory glance, but I wanted to put it out there for you so we all have the same understanding of the elements. This is what I consider 101 material. I know it's found a lot of places, but I put it together just so we're all on the same page. The courses that are found on my website are much longer than this, and they go more in depth and detail, so I encourage you to check it out. They are also generally not 101 concepts in some ways, but other classes are, and you can expect those that are basic to be expanded on over the near future. Anyway, I hope this clarifies any questions you might have had regarding the elements, specifically as it clears up some astrological questions. For more information, check out the website, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we'll see where things grow from here. Happy full moon and blessings.